So that video finished on cyber risks, and these risks have been increasing and evolving in novel ways over the last several years. As the video mentioned, this has been accelerated somewhat by the effects of the pandemic, including the push to a hybrid working model. And now, with the military conflict in Ukraine, we're seeing the potential for this risk to increase in frequency and severity. This has governments and companies on high alert and looking to fortify their security measures against this risk. That is why I'm delighted to have two external experts here with me today, Jonathan Englert and Jeremy Kirk. Jonathan is the co-founder of Redphone Cyber, which is a crisis communications team dedicated to managing cyber incidents. And Jeremy Kirk is a seasoned tech security journalist, currently the executive editor of Information Security Media Group, and also the creator of the Ransomware podcast. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having us, Matt.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. As we heard from Patrick, this is a risk that many of us are still trying to get our heads around. Jeremy, maybe I can start with you since you've had to report on this to a more general audience. What are some of these cyber threats that companies are now facing?
Yeah, over the last 10 years, the landscape has changed dramatically. So you have criminal actors that are looking to get into your systems and steal your data. Maybe they want to use that data for their own fraudulent purposes. Maybe they want to steal the data and sell that data. You have nation state actors that are looking to get into your systems to perhaps steal intellectual property. And right now we're in the midst of probably what is the greatest crime wave to ever hit the internet, which is ransomware. And this is where criminal groups get into your systems. Usually they first steal your data and then they encrypt the rest of it. So companies wake up the next day and nothing works. And the attackers demand a $1 million ransom in Bitcoin. And this has caught a lot of companies flat-footed. And if they don't have the proper cyber resilience, they don't have a lot of options necessarily.
Wow. Okay. I guess maybe for you, Jonathan. Jeremy mentioned state actors. Who are the others that are doing these attacks, and what's the sophistication level?
Well, look, it's hard to have a kind of God's eye view of the entire, scene. I would say, just mentioning the state actor stuff, if a state actor, if a government wants to get into a system, they'll get into that system, and sometimes you won't even know it. I feel like the actual risk is quite widespread. They're obviously, they're groups, they're criminal gangs, and then they're individuals, right? They're probably kids, and then they're bots as well. I mean, it can be anything. It can really be anything. And I think the key thing is there's a lot of hype, I think, around fear, right? And sort of leading, almost paralyzing fear. But the reality is, Jeremy mentioned it, resilience. Like having sort of being honest and mature inside an organization. And that's sort of what I look for. And when we're assessing an organization, that's what we look for. Are people even aware, really, of cybersecurity? And are they taking some basic measures or advanced measures, depending on the industry, to deal with it?
Great. No, thanks. Sounds like from Jeremy, there's a lot of potential risks, and from Jonathan, it's coming from multiple angles here. What is the focus of these bad actors? Are we talking SMEs or large multinationals? Is there a particular sector they're focused on? And if so, what sectors are better or worse positioned?
Well, look, I would jump in on this and say there's a lot of target of opportunity stuff going on. And I would almost say that in the audience, I suspect, on a personal level, say, this idea of a business compromise, business email compromise, that's quite common where people wake up and they're like, maybe they're doing a real estate transaction, right? Buying a home, and suddenly there are tens of thousands of dollars are being transferred into the wrong account. And that's a good example of someone possibly sitting in your system, what we'd call maybe an advanced persistent threat. Someone's literally in your email, learning about your behaviors, and then doing that. Now, that's on a personal level. The same thing happens in business, but we're not actually seeing it, I think, as widely reported because people are embarrassed by it or they keep it secret or whatever. But I think it's quite common, yeah.
Yeah, when I think about what kind of sectors are most exposed, banks have huge budgets, and they can have very well-fledged security teams. They can buy the latest technologies, although I would say that's not necessarily the key to good security. Good policy is too. But when you look at other sectors, such as like perhaps kind of like education or government, or even the medical industry, right? It's like their core competency isn't delivering, like, say, technology or software. It's delivering education and it's medical services. So they may have people on their IT team that have to do lots of different things. They may have to wear a security hat, but also 5 other hats, and so they don't have individual specialty in security. Whereas like banks and financial services, they can have those really larger teams, and so that's why it's quite important for those sectors to really practice good cybersecurity hygiene and follow the best practices.
Yeah, and I think just with respect to what Jeremy said, you are seeing at the very top level banks being quite hardened. So what we've seen is very hardened targets, so that deep resources, lots of really good regulatory stuff, governance. But then you go just step down, and it's surprising. Very large companies that don't have that. So what you're looking for is, does the company have, a chief security officer? Do they have a chief information security officer, a sort of C-suite, technical awareness? And oftentimes you don't see that, and there's a tech crunch going on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of a staffing shortage. People with cybersecurity skills are in really high demand, and like the Australian government and lots of other governments are trying to foster those industries, encourage startups, cybersecurity startups, and also foster education initiatives so they have these skilled people, 10 years from now when, as things kind of even grow worse.
Yeah, and it was worsened over COVID as well, because you weren't getting the same tech talent coming in, which we rely on. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, it kind of, I guess, sounds like you're as much exposed if you're in a sector that maybe not is a bigger target, but you're less prepared. You're almost worse off than in some of these sectors that might be big targets that are more prepared. Yeah. We did mention financial institutions and some other kind of critical infrastructure. I did want to just, it's obviously very topical with what's going on in the Ukraine around other pieces of critical infrastructure, and I just wanted to get a sense from you on things like utilities. How prepared are they for attacks?
I'll take that one. I mean, there's been a massive effort to try to increase the baseline cybersecurity. If you take, say, for instance, if you take water plants and wastewater plants, these often operate on, they're funded by cities, they have low budgets. Again, it's kind of like the one person who has to do the whole IT thing, including security. And they haven't been necessarily really well prepared. So there's a big effort by government agencies everywhere to try to bring these, up to speed. If you look back, speaking of Ukraine, if you look back, it was 7 years ago that the power in Kiev was knocked out because of a cyber attack. And there are continuing concerns that is going to be part, or probably already has been a part of the current conflict. So if you think from like kind of an economic standpoint, if your electricity goes out due to a cyber attack, or say you're an aluminum smelter and you're dependent on fresh supplies of water, but the dam won't open, right? That can affect your economic activity as a nation.
And I think this is a whole of like market issue, right? Like in the sense that cybersecurity can be very conceptual until it happens to you, and then it feels like someone's putting a gun in your face, And we've seen this in organizations, and there's this leap where they have to then realize, oh my gosh, everything's been shut down, or all that data is gone. Right, and so organizations need to kind of know what's really important. What are their crown jewels? So is it operations that they can't stop, or they can't afford to let stop, or is it personal data? That's really important. But I think that level of awareness, oftentimes it happens after a breach too.
Absolutely.
That they suddenly they get better at it, as it were.
Businesses are so dependent on IT, right? Because it's just the core of kind of everything of communicating. And they've never, many haven't really role-played of like, well, what happens if we come in and absolutely nothing worked? The phones don't work, the email doesn't work, all your invoices, all your orders, they're all encrypted by cyber criminals on the other side of the globe. How are you going to start to do business? How are you going to recover? And part of the key to figuring out the solution to that is like, well, let's let's role play. Let's think, what are we going to do? What are our most important systems? In what order would we bring them back up? I mean, I've spoken to so many companies that have been infected with ransomware, and oftentimes the first step is like, what's your Gmail account so I can email you? Like CEOs using WhatsApp to talk to their, talk to the rest of their board and say, communicate, what's happened. And all these things can be planned for, but a lot of companies think, nah, it's never really going to happen to me until it does.
Yeah, and it's strange. It's not to induce fear, but I mean, it oftentimes when I've been when I've seen these incidents up close, it's like this little thing. Oh, we just heard from this. I was involved in one bug bounty incident, and we've heard from this white hat hacker, right? Those are the good hackers, right? And he wants to write an article on this data thing that he found on our site. And it was just like this little drumbeat, but it's super serious. It was a financial sectors company. It had all these implications, But it begins like that, and it's funny to watch management not quite understand all the implications of it.
Sorry,
yeah.
Jonathan. I mean, you mentioned the bug bounty, and maybe for our audience, can explain what that is.
Yeah, we should.
But
yeah.
With that as well, I mean, what other things can companies do, and that we should be looking for to understand if those companies are well prepared?
Yeah, well, I mean, a bug bounty is a good place to start. So a bug bounty is essentially a call out to the community of technical community to sort of test your resilience, your technology, right? So one of the things I look for is if you're a mature company, you'd have a bug bounty program, right? So you'd either say, yes, we welcome bug bounties, and these are the terms, or we don't, right? But a company that doesn't have that, that's kind of an indicator to me, right? Like, it's sort of like broken windows policing, back in the day. I don't know, I'm from New York with Rudolph Giuliani. It's like you can see from the exterior of a company things that might not be right.
Like a lot of software problems might be found by 15-year-olds on the internet. And what these bug bounties is where you pay a reward for that information.
That's a good definition.
Or vulnerability disclosure policies. And that says, hey, if you bring a security problem to our attention and don't tell anybody else about it and let us fix it, we won't go to the police and try to prosecute you, because that's what kind of happened in the old days. People would go to companies and say, hey, all your data is exposed here, and they would just immediately call the prosecutors. But now, it's a sign of maturity to say, hey, we'll take an input from the outside community, and we'll be adults about this in a way that, thank you very much for letting us know. Thank you very much for not stealing our data and selling it on the dark web. Another thing too is just to look, especially for larger companies, is if they have C-level executives that are like a chief security officer, chief information security officer, if they have that sort of structure. You won't see that at the smaller SMB, kind of level, but at the C-suite you will. And companies they're still having this conversation. If they do hire a chief security officer, they may still be having those conversations with the board about security, because the boards don't understand it. As we were saying earlier, it is kind of like this thing that's out there that nobody really understands. It's a hard to quantify risk. Yeah. So those conversations are still happening within companies too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a whole of community issue in terms of resilience, right? That people should be communicating. So the boards, I've encountered boards, for example, where if they're on a breach and data's say gone off, right, personal data, and they almost want to hold it too close to the chest, right? But there's a balance between, say, instant notification, and being so secretive, and which is wrong, actually, because the history of breaches really is, for the most part, that the companies that manage it well, involve, good communication, et cetera, they come out of it better, typically. But the education is extraordinary. Like, it's really interesting to see the varying levels of awareness around cyber at the board level, director level, all that. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's super helpful. I mean, I guess we've mentioned having the right people in place in some of these processes to test systems. What about cyber risk insurance? And I noticed we didn't mention that. What are your thoughts on that? And what are some of the I guess strengths and pitfalls there?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So cyber insurance, emerged. It's actually been around for quite a long time, although it didn't really get taken up until companies started being attacked more. And like companies that I've spoken to, for the podcast about who've been infected with ransomware, a couple of them did have cyber insurance, and it totally pulled them out of the muck. The lawyers came in, they brought in forensics people, they brought in incident response people, because what you need in a situation like that is often just more knowledgeable hands to help you do things. But the market is changing because these attacks are successful and it's really expensive to do forensics and have investigations, is that cyber insurers are kind of, they're taking a hit. And so what they're doing, insurance companies are now lowering the coverage limits, making it harder to get coverage in the first place. Like they want to see that you've passed, information security audits, that you're doing all the baseline things, that you've done penetration tests. You've hired hackers to come in and look at your company and try to break in. And they want to see that, okay, you've ticked all these boxes. So, but it means it's a tough thing for companies, because if the limit is lowering on the coverage, that means you're going to have to make up the difference if it costs more than that limit. So you can't just rely on, oh, I've got an insurance policy, I can be lackadaisical about this. It's really the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also say it's not like property insurance, right? It's not like, oh, they stole my stereo, I get a stereo back. You can have radically different outcomes, right? With respect to the end of this, of a breach, right? And so in other words, you can do the comms, or you can do the legal or whatever, but you can have, a company emerge with its brand really damaged, or, not. But the cybersecurity insurance is just paying effectively for those practitioners to sort of help plug the gaps.
Yeah, and cyber insurers were also paying some of the ransoms, and this is
that's true as well.
This is a very controversial thing that was happening, and I mean, I'm going to predict that that's not going to happen, right? So if you don't have your data, if you don't have proper backups, I don't think the insurance companies are going to bail people out much longer by paying cyber criminals to get a decryption key, because obviously that's a bad moral model, and it furthers these types of attacks.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, right, that no matter what kind of technology comes on the scene, we're not going to stop these breaches, right? They're not. Almost every company will, or in fact, my gut feeling is almost every organization has already been breached. Oftentimes they don't know it, right? Because there might be someone going in to get a specific piece of information, and sometimes in some respects they're lucky not to know it because they don't actually have to go through the whole disclosure process. But so I think it's a more mature position is to just go, this is going to happen. How do we ready for it to come out?
So, I mean, it sounds like cyber risk insurance is helpful, but it's certainly not going to be a magic bullet.
No.
I mean, I guess we talked a bit about the potential response. I mean, can you maybe just elaborate a bit more? This has happened. What are some of the responses companies can have, and how do they recover from some of these attacks?
Well, I would say one thing, because I think you've told me about the Maersk example, so I'm going to give that one to you. But I mean, I feel like it's not one size fits all. It really has to do with what does the company do, and what kind of attack was it. There's a big difference between, for example, an individual in a company realizing they've clicked on a bad link and their email's been compromised, right? And there might be notification requirements around that, and an entire operation going down, like my Garmin watch. Garmin got hacked, and they're out of commission for a week. They're a big difference. So that the response is going to matter. I would say communication is really important. Figuring out all the stakeholders, mapping out what the terrain is. But it's a very very specific ad hoc kind of thing. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, on a kind of light technical level, I mean, it's really having good backups and practicing how you would recover. And it's, companies that go through and go, right, we need this system going up first, then this one, then this one, then this one. Knowing how to get the data off the backups into those systems quickly. Often companies go, oh, we have backups, but they've never practiced actually getting that data back into their systems, and they realize it's the same story every time. They don't realize how long it's going to take to recover. They don't realize how much it's going to cost either. And it's if you have expectations like that and you practice it and you realize, okay, well, this is how long. And Jonathan, to your point about communication being really important, you're going to have to talk to all your suppliers and all your customers and tell them what's going on. They're going to want to know if they're potentially at risk, because you might have interconnected IT systems too. So the communications part is extremely important too.
Yeah. And there are SLAs involved, right? So service level agreements or contractual things that might require you to disclose earlier than even the regulatory structures.
That's what I was going to get at. So I mean, there's regulatory requirements, right, where companies have to, go out and basically say that these things have happened. But you did mention about impacts to suppliers. I mean, just on that kind of supply chain topic, is it really that they are only as well protected as the weakest link in their supply chain? And if so, is there anything they can do to shore up those supply chains?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I'll give you an example. Maersk, the global shipping giant, everybody's seen their containers. So in 2017, they were a victim of a cyber attack that wasn't even directly against them. So this example is also really relevant for what's going on in Ukraine right now. So there was a small software company in Ukraine that developed this accounting software. And if you did business in Ukraine, you had to use this software. So companies, lots of companies obviously in Ukraine did, lots of companies around the world did. So there was a software update for that accounting software that was substituted with malicious, they call it wiper malware. So if it gets on your computer, infects your computer, it completely wrecks it. This infected nearly all of Maersk's computers worldwide. And they thought that this was going to perhaps just be the end of Maersk. Like the company was going to go out of business. This is an 80,000 person global company that's been in business for decades, thought this might be the end, is this cyber attack. And it wasn't even, it was just the fact that they used this accounting software. And that's the kind of that's why cyber risk is so difficult to understand or also to defend against, because it's like a lightning bolt kind of attack. It's like the lightning bolt that comes out of the sky and burns your house down, right? So companies, they are doing things. They're trying to vet their suppliers and ensure, like I said, the baseline cybersecurity practices. But, there's also some things that are kind of out of your control too.
Yeah, and it's asymmetrical too. It's that Maersk example is excellent, but then there might be someone inside, right? So it's more of an information security thing. So someone, even disgruntled employees, or a socially engineered event, where someone takes advantage of the fact that the CEO is posting on, their socials that they're out, and then they do a very granular kind of social engineering to their team to try to get inside. So, yeah.
Right. Wow. That's I guess some scary stuff on all the angles that are out there. Maybe just again, what are some of the things that we should be looking for? I mean, we don't, we're not all cyber experts, but we have to be, assessing companies. I mean, can you maybe just give a little listing of the most important? I mean, I know we've talked about, people. Do they have the right executives in the right places? I think I'm hearing more about culture though, in some the processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also there's interesting aspects of cyber defense. It's kind of like good policies too. Like for instance, as Jonathan referenced too, it's like I think a lot of companies have given up completely repelling attacks. And so what kind of the trend is in this area is detecting the attack quickly. And if attackers get in, limiting the amount of where they can go in your systems. So often this might involve kind of behavioral analysis of your company's network. Like, okay, Matt usually comes in, he works from 9 to 5, and now, wait, Matt's logging in, someone using Matt's login credentials is coming in from Hong Kong, right? And Matt's just gone down the hallway to get a cup of coffee or something. So that's one of the, very simplified versions of a trigger of this is anomalous behavior. And a lot of security vendors are focusing on these kinds of technologies to look, okay, that little bit is different. And they can look at thousands of different things and map these kinds of things and go, okay, this is different, we should look into this. And that's when a human can get involved, like a security analyst, and go, yeah, okay, this looks like this might be the start of an attack. So another thing is kind of segmenting, knowing what your crown jewels are. Jonathan references too, knowing where your most valuable data is and putting the most protections around it. It makes sense, but kind of inventorying your data, making an inventory of your data, a lot of companies just don't do this. So it might all be kind of scattered, some in less secure systems than others. So you want to limit what they call that blast radius. So if they get in, they won't be able to go very far. Another simple example is just with, we all have to log into everything, is two-factor authentication. So you use this with your banking app. You might get it over SMS. So that means if I get Jonathan's username and password, I can't just log in, I'll need that code. Now there's more sophisticated ways to get that code, but that stops about 99.8% of the most common sort of street level cyber criminal attacks. And it's not an expensive thing to implement for companies either. So for like SMBs and things like that, it's one of the best things you can do.
Yeah. And look, I just piggyback on that. I think culture, right? A culture of openness, non-punishing too, and not fear around this, because you need to continue to operate, right? So I would say don't punish employees for surfacing issues around information security. So if they have clicked on the wrong link, you want them to tell you sooner rather than later.
This is excellent stuff, guys. I mean, frankly, I feel like we could sit here for hours and just pick your brains and really get to the bottom of this issue. Unfortunately, we're running a bit short on time, but you know what I've heard today is there's a lot of different attacks. They're coming from multiple angles. The culture and the processes that are in place are very important to drive that response. But I just really did want to thank you guys for your time today. It's been just a really enlightening chat. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.